What's up, Bigfooters and other outdoorly enthused folks? My name is Brady, and today we'll be discussing footprint casts from the Wichita Mountains. Alright guys, so in my time researching Sasquatches in the Wichita Mountains, I've come across two possible Sasquatch tracks that I eventually casted. And that's these two guys right here. Pretty similar in size from two completely different locations. They were both discovered in very squatchy locations, so without further ado, let's go ahead and start this analysis. So the first cast we're going to be talking about is this one from the Parallel Forest. I've been to the Parallel Forest a number of times. I was actually just recently there a couple of weeks ago. And the Parallel Forest is kind of significant because it has this haunted reputation. And if you know me, you know that I think that a lot of these haunted forests and things similar to that could actually be misidentified Sasquatch activity. And I think that's most likely the case for the Parallel Forest. People report hearing screams and seeing shadowy figures in the Parallel Forest. There's been at least one stick structure that I know of that's been discovered, but that could easily be human-made. But the Parallel Forest is also connected to this large swath of forest on the northern half of Mount Scott. It's an area that I've explored a couple of times and that I definitely want to get back out into. And if I was a betting man, I would say that this larger swath of forest would be the most likely place for a Sasquatch in the Wichita Mountains. And right around there is the Parallel Forest, and that's where this track was found. The Parallel Forest, and really the Wichita Mountains in general, are home to tons of wildlife and food sources. Things like bison, longhorn deer, elk, coyotes, wild hogs, raccoons, beavers, squirrels, rabbits, snakes, birds, frogs, lizards, fish, berries, mushrooms, cactus, spiders, a bunch of creepy crawlies. There's a lot of food sources to choose from in the Wichita Mountains. And there's quite a few water sources in the Wichita Mountains. There's a good number of lakes, and all of those lakes have different interconnecting streams and creeks. And there's a couple of large lakes on the edge of the Wichita Mountains, Lake Elmer Thomas and Lake Latonka. And those large lakes are going to provide year-round water sources for any Sasquatches in the area, as well as the many creeks that diverge from the lakes. And this larger path of forest that I've been going on about actually juts up against the very edge of Lake Latonka. So that's an area where they could easily, under the cover of darkness and the cover of the trees, find water in the area. So this impression was discovered earlier this year on March 29th and was later casted on April 2nd. Measured out, the impression itself is about 12.5 inches long by about 7 inches wide at the ball and 6 inches wide at the heel area. I'll go ahead and provide my more in-depth field notes for any of you that are interested. Now, the reason that it took a couple of days to cast this track is when I first saw it, I really just assumed it was a couple of bison tracks that were just right up next to each other. And that's really why I decided not to cast it. But then, it started going through my mind the famous Cliff Barrickman saying, "When in doubt, cast it." And where I initially thought was the separation of two different tracks perhaps was a mid-tarsal break from a Sasquatch footprint. It was kind of a long shot, but I decided to cast it anyway, just in case. I wouldn't really be able to sleep at night if I passed up on the opportunity to cast a possible Sasquatch footprint. So I eventually made it back out to that location and collected this cast. It was definitely a pretty old impression when I casted it, with no real distinct characteristics other than that bump directly in the middle of the cast. It was pretty old, and it was pretty dang close to a popular trail in this area. The Parallel Forest is a very popular spot to visit, and this cast was obtained, not even 3 feet from the hiking trail. So that was very suspicious. And before I wanted to really share my thoughts on this cast, I decided to get some feedback from other really more educated researchers in the field. So I took this thing to the 2019 Ohio Bigfoot Conference and shared it with Dr. Jeff Meldrum and Cliff Barrickman, two fellow researchers that really specialize in Bigfoot footprint casts. So after doing a lot of examining of the cast myself, and after hearing the feedback from other researchers, I narrowed it down to really 3 possible suspects. Now, suspect 0, which is really just an honorable mention, is human. I never really considered this to be a possibility. The ground was incredibly hard. I wasn't making any tracks whatsoever in this area. You would have to have like a really huge Sasquatch-sized guy to make an impression this deep in that ground. So I don't think somebody was out there walking around with a carved wood cutout, and if they were, I would have seen other prints similar to this in the area. This was actually the only print of its kind that I was able to find in the entire area, which in itself is kind of suspicious. But I definitely don't think this is human-made. For a human to make it, the only way that would be possible is if it had recently rained and the ground was very soggy, very muddy, and then I would have seen the other tracks of the human walking around and making more tracks. So I do not think this is human. But you know, when it comes to Sasquatch research, you really have to eliminate every other option before you arrive at Sasquatch. Sasquatches should always be innocent until proven guilty. You should not say something is Sasquatch evidence until you have completely eliminated all other possibilities. So suspect number one, and a pretty common suspect among Sasquatch footprint casts, is a double-stepping bear. They are often misidentified for Sasquatch tracks because of their relatively human-like appearance. In his book, Sasquatch Legend Meets Science, Dr. Meldrum writes, quote, "The hind foot of the bear resembles a human's pedal appendage in its flat-footed or plantigrade appearance and its retention of all 5 distinct toes that make contact with the ground." End quote. And in his Sasquatch Field Guide, Dr. Meldrum notes that sometimes these bear footprints can, quote, overlap or register, giving an impression of elongated footprints spaced in a 2-footed pattern. This can be misidentified as a Sasquatch track, end quote. With this in mind, at the Ohio Bigfoot Conference, Dr. Meldrum noted these 2 small bumps about halfway on the footprint, and that could indicate that this half of the impression would be the forepaw of a bear. Dr. Meldrum also noted what could be a small toe on the upper left side of the cast, which could mean that this is the left foot of a bear, as the small toe is on the inside of a bear's foot. The bottom half of the cast could be the hind paw of a bear, but it's really too indistinct. There's not really any characteristics or details that would indicate that. Just if this would be the forepaw, this would then be the hind paw, perhaps. Here is a rough interpretation of what Dr. Meldrum saw in the cast. However, I find this suspect to be extremely unlikely, as bears, as far as everybody knows, were wiped out of the Wichita Mountains during westward expansion in the 1800s and early 1900s. It would be absolutely remarkable and extremely good news if this was a bear print, but I think that that is so unlikely that we can rule that suspect out altogether. I would absolutely love it if this was a bear print, but I find that very unlikely. My second potential suspect is actually a Sasquatch. Now, even though this print isn't very big and there's not a whole lot of detail in the cast, there are a few key characteristics that could point to this being a Sasquatch print. Most notable of these features is, of course, the possible mid-tarsal break in the middle of the cast. This mid-foot flexibility is a feature seen in all non-human primates, and it allows their foot to conform more easily to the uneven terrain found in the wild. In his Sasquatch Field Guide, Dr. Meldrum notes that, quote, "Because of the flat, flexible foot, the mid-tarsus breaks or flexes as the heel lifts and weight is concentrated under the forefoot," end quote. And quote, "Pressure transferred to the ground is released as material is displaced towards the heel imprint. This may produce a midfoot pressure ridge," end quote. The appearance of this possible mid-tarsal break is actually the primary reason I even ended up deciding to cast this impression. The general dimensions of the impression also line up pretty well with other Sasquatch footprints in the dataset. Sasquatch footprints always tend to be about half as wide as they are long, and that's exactly what we see here. This impression is 12.5 inches long by about 7 inches wide at the ball. That means its width is actually over half of its length. So even if you round up with this length being about 13 inches, double the width is still 14 inches, a full inch longer than the length of the track. This footprint from the Pacific Northwest is 14.5 inches long and about 6 3/4 of an inch wide. So even though this print from the Pacific Northwest is larger than this print from the parallel forest, they are both about half as wide as they are long, give or take an inch or so. And human prints, for example, are generally only about a third as wide as they are long. My foot is about 10.5 inches long, while only 3.5 inches wide at the ball. So if you multiply my width by 3, you get 10.5. And this sort of 3-to-1 ratio, or 1 to 1/3 ratio, is seen generally in all humans. Shaq's feet, for example, are 22.25 of an inch long and only about 7.5 inches wide, following the same ratio that you see in my foot and all other human feet. So with the dimensions of the cast, the possible mid-tarsal break, and with the haunted/Sasquatch activity that is noted in this area, this cast started to become rather compelling. However, I do have some very important issues with this cast impression. Most notably is the lack of any other similar impressions in the entire surrounding area. Upon discovering the track, I combed the entire area for anything similar. Sasquatches are perfectly normal biological creatures, and if they leave one footprint, chances are they're going to leave more than one. And I didn't find any other sign of a Sasquatch-like creature moving through the area. If this Sasquatch is going to leave deep impressions, you'd think it would leave more than one, unless it was intentional. And I do not see why a Sasquatch would intentionally leave an impression right next to a very popular hiking trail. That just doesn't make a whole lot of sense to me, and I can't really see a Sasquatch doing that. I also actually do have a problem with the depth of this footprint. The size of this footprint wouldn't indicate a super huge individual like a massive 600-pound Sasquatch. This track isn't a whole lot longer than my foot, so you'd think it would be maybe a younger male Sasquatch or maybe a smaller female. So I don't think it's going to be as heavy as the giants that a lot of people are reporting. And while I was walking through this area, I wasn't really leaving any footprint at all in my hard boots. So it doesn't make a whole lot of sense that a Sasquatch with a soft, padded foot that's not even really full grown would leave such a deep impression. Again, unless it was intentional, and I just don't see that happening. I could maybe buy a Sasquatch of this size leaving a deep impression in that soil, but really I just don't see a Sasquatch of that size leaving such a deep impression in that hard ground. And you could say maybe the impression was left after a heavy rain when the ground was much softer. But that again raises the question, if the ground is softer and it's leaving this print, why wouldn't there be more prints in the surrounding area? I just don't find that very likely. So even though it looks compelling on the surface, I'm starting to think it's pretty unlikely that a Sasquatch left this impression. So after all of my examination of the cast, I found one final suspect that matches the location, the dimensions, and the depth of this footprint. And that suspect is rather common in the Wichita Mountains, the American bison. Bison and longhorn are extremely prevalent in the Wichita Mountains, and I encounter them pretty much every time I'm out and about in the area. The dimensions of this cast line up extremely well if you view it as two separate impressions rather than one large impression. Here is a rough interpretation of how I view this cast. Seems to make a lot of sense that a bison left this impression. The depth of the cast can also easily be explained by a bison, as they don't have flat, soft padded feet. They have these hard hooves with massive amounts of weight behind them. I've even seen bigger and deeper bison tracks than this in the area. So while different aspects of the impression can line up to other suspects, every single one of the aspects combined leads to a bison. You can't cherry pick the details that you like in your evidence. You have to view the thing as a whole. And as a whole, I think it's a bison track. And as far as the possible toe definition that was noted by both me and Professor Meldrum, I think we can pretty much mark that up to this being a very blob squatchy cast. There is not a whole bunch of detail there. I think we were both really seeing what we wanted to see. So I think the toes in this case are just a case of Sasquatch cast pareidolia. Pareidolia is the phenomenon of seeing familiar things in unfamiliar objects, we have this blobby cast right here with not a whole lot of detail, but since we were looking for those details, that's what we discovered in this cast. So it's kind of like a Rorschach ink blot test of a Sasquatch footprint. But overall, I think it's safe to say that in this case, the culprit is a bison. After all, as one of my heroes, Cliff Barrickman, always says, a footprint is not the shape of a foot, it's the shape of the damage done to the ground. So even though this doesn't necessarily look exactly like a bison footprint, it doesn't have to. It's the shape of the damage that the bison foot did to the ground. However, this does not mean that there are not Sasquatches in this area. It's still an excellent location with a long history, and I think it's an excellent spot for continued research in the future. That is, if Sasquatches are in the Wichita Mountains, which I think they probably are. There are at least a handful of sightings that I know of in the Wichita Mountains. And that just also goes to reinforce the saying, when in doubt, cast it. If I had not casted this impression, I might have still been going around thinking it might have been a Sasquatch footprint. But after examining the cast up close, I think we can firmly say this is a bison footprint and not a Sasquatch. And with that, that leads us to the next cast that we'll be examining today, this cast from Elk Mountain. Just a moment ago I noted the few sightings that I know of in the Wichita Mountains, and at least a couple of those have occurred on or near Elk Mountain. On this particular trip, I was led to this area by Mike Shanks, a fellow researcher. So we went out squatching in this area, he was showing me some of his best spots, and upon arriving back on the Elk Mountain Trail after some off-trail hiking, we noticed a large-looking tree structure on the side of the trail. Now, if you know me, I'm not real huge on tree structures, but we'll get into that in a little bit. So we went over to examine this possible tree structure and noticed a human-looking impression in the ground right next to the structure. And this was a very human-looking footprint, but I would say not a human footprint. So after taking a few pictures and videos of the spot, we moved on and eventually left the area. But fortunately, I decided to return the next day and cast the footprint. The footprint was discovered initially on August 24th, but it wasn't casted until the next day on August 25th. And after getting the cast out of the ground, waiting a few weeks, and cleaning it off, this is the cast that we end up with. Now, the footprint in the cast itself was about 9.5 to 10 inches long, 4.5 inches wide at the ball, and 3.5 inches wide at the heel. Most notable of the features seen in the cast is the apparent big toe that clearly jumped out to us as soon as we saw it. It was a left foot headed southwest towards some of the denser vegetation atop Elk Mountain, but the cast itself was discovered in a grassier meadow area along with this possible tree structure. It did rain briefly overnight in between the day of discovery and the day of casting, so the detail in the cast probably isn't quite as sharp as it would have been if I had casted it the day we discovered it, but when I arrived and I found the footprint, it was pretty much identical, so there wasn't too much of a disturbance by the weather on the cast. Now, it's pretty clear from that possible big toe that this is not any other animal except for a human or a Sasquatch. And frankly, I don't think this thing is made by a human. First and foremost is the terrain where this thing was found. This area is very rocky and full of biological landmines. There are cactuses everywhere, the grass is very dry and could easily get stuck in somebody's foot. There's cactuses under the grass, there's cactuses in bushes, and there's snakes everywhere in the bushes. I don't see any reason why anybody would be walking out there barefoot. I'm also confident in saying that a human could not replicate the depth of this footprint, at least while barefoot. I continuously stomped around this entire area trying to replicate the depth of the footprint, and I just couldn't do it. You could not see where I was walking. And I don't think Mike was hoaxing me. I don't think he could have replicated the depth of the track either. And if you're gonna hoax somebody, you're not gonna hoax a human-sized small footprint. You're gonna get out there with a big footprint and make a big impression in the ground. So with humans ruled out, let's talk about how this thing could be a Sasquatch footprint. It looks very human-like, oddly enough, with the big toe very visible. And if it were in any other soil, if it was in any other substrate, I would probably definitely say this is just a human footprint. A human with an oddly pronounced big toe. but the depth in the soil just did not seem human to me. The length to width ratio is not quite as dramatic as the last footprint found in the parallel forest, but it does seem to be bigger than the length to width ratio of a human. Like we said earlier, the Sasquatch footprint is about half as wide as it is long, while human footprints are only about a third as wide as they are long. The width of this footprint is 47% the width of the length, which puts it at about 50%, where the width of my footprint is only 33% of the length. And as it turns out, this footprint, once again, the width of this footprint is also 47% its length. So it does appear that this footprint does match the length to width ratio of a Sasquatch. However, this particular print does taper down at the heel quite a bit more than I've seen in other Sasquatch footprints. They do have a little bit more of a taper, but this one tapers down about an inch or so. That's pretty big considering the smaller size of the cast. But really, there's no other details present in the cast other than the general dimensions and the big toe and maybe some other possible smaller toes. But you can't even really see those smaller toes, they're just barely hinted at. So other than that, there's not really a whole lot of detail present in the cast. No dermatoglyphics, not really any hints of any midfoot flexibility. This mark is only here because that's where a rock was. That rock is still in the ground. But other than that, not really a whole lot of detail. So going off the sizes of other prints in the dataset and other individuals leaving those prints, I would say that this would probably be a younger Sasquatch, like a juvenile. Mike's personal theory was that it was a younger Sasquatch practicing making structures, and that was the structure that we found. I mean, I don't really have anything to refute that hypothesis, but I would just say based on the observations that we saw at the site, that might be a little bit of a leap, so I personally wouldn't go that far. So with that big toe and the size and the dimensions, it really seems to indicate that the only animal that could have made this impression is a Sasquatch. The only animal. Not the only thing that could have left this impression. After sitting with this footprint for a couple of weeks, I have a few questions as to how and why this footprint was made. First and foremost, how did such a small individual leave such a deep footprint? Again, Sasquatches have soft, padded feet, similar to humans but with a bigger fat pad. And if I wasn't making any impression with my hard boots, why would this smaller individual leave such a deep track? The only reason such a track would be left is if it was intentional. And again, I don't think they're leaving intentional footprints unless it's to scare somebody. In order to leave such a deep impression, it would have really had to scrape at the ground. Would have had to put a lot of force into this thing, and then I don't think you'd be able to see toe definition if it was scraping the ground that hard. And you could bring up the argument again, maybe it had just rained and then the creature left its footprint. Then there should definitely be more prints of its kind in the area. But there was nothing even close to this in the area. This was the only impression that we found. Again, Sasquatches are perfectly normal biological creatures. They should be leaving more than just one footprint. And really, the hard hitter in this case, why was the bottom of the cast mostly just dirt? Something just moving through the area would have pressed down the top layer of vegetation, and there would still be vegetation at the bottom of the cast. The only reason I could see there being really just dirt as if it's something that's been there for a very long time, and some hikers come along, or maybe some inclement weather moves along and moves it out of the way, and it's no longer there. So I think it's very possible, if not likely, that this impression was actually left by a rock, not a Sasquatch. With all of these questions coming together, all of these different factors that don't seem to wholly add up, I think a rock is the most likely suspect in this case. I don't think it's a human, and at this point I'm thinking it's probably not a Sasquatch. Another case of Bigfoot footprint pareidolia. With these more blob squatchy impressions, it becomes more and more of a Rorschach test, just like the last impression. We were Bigfooters out there looking for evidence. We come across this structure and we see what looks to be an impression, and we see a Sasquatch footprint. The big toe could have very easily been another smaller rock, or maybe even just a part of the rock that was laying there. But you know, other people may still disagree with my assessment of this impression. It does still have the shape of a very human-looking footprint, and it was right next to a possible structure. So some people may still lean towards Sasquatch, and that's perfectly fine, but I really lean more towards this being a rock that was either lifted up by a person or moved out of the way by inclement weather. So let's talk about that structure for a second. The structure is obviously made by something. I would say that's definitely not made by weather. There were no other trees in the area. It was in this open grass field, and there were these 4 logs interwoven, interconnected to one another. Clearly not naturally made, unless all these logs rolled down the mountain, became interwoven together, and it created this structure. I definitely do not find that very likely at all, but I think a human could definitely make that structure. The logs really weren't as heavy as they look. You could lift them if you had 1 or 2 people putting it together. But my guess is the trails are not super well maintained, so perhaps some of the Forest Service guys out there put together this structure to show the direction of the trail, and that's why it was so close to this trail. I'm not saying that Sasquatches don't make structures, although I'm kind of iffy on structures myself, but why would it be so dang close to a very popular trail? People go to Elk Mountain all the time. It's a very popular spot. Why would there be a structure and a footprint so close to so many other people? I just don't find that very likely. And really, as far as I know, nobody's really seen a Sasquatch making a structure. People have seen Sasquatches leaving tracks. People have seen Sasquatches doing calls. A lot of these other behavioral things that we attribute to Sasquatches, people have seen them do. As far as I know, nobody's seen a Sasquatch build structures. People have seen them carrying logs and sticks, and that could very well be for structures or huts. But a lot of these structures, I'm pretty dang iffy on. I'm not saying they're not made by Sasquatch, I'm just saying they're not good enough evidence to verify for sure that this was Sasquatch related. And a lot of people are probably going to disagree with me on that one. But if you have seen a Sasquatch make a structure, I would love to hear about it. But if you still want to believe that this is a Sasquatch structure and a Sasquatch footprint, that's perfectly fine by me. I just want to share what I find and let you guys decide for yourselves, but I also want to make my own decisions and share those with you guys, what I think. And in this case, I think it's most likely a human-made structure along with a rock-made impression. Or maybe it's a Sasquatch structure, and since we saw the structure, we saw this print that wasn't actually a print. The structure could still be legit, and the print just not be true. It could be a mix. But in this case, I'm going to say that neither of them are Sasquatch related. Once again, Sasquatches should always be considered innocent until proven guilty. Sasquatches should always be the very last suspect that you consider when looking at possible evidence. These things are very rare, and the chances of you coming across evidence at all, let alone frequently, is very rare. So make sure you always eliminate every possibility first before arriving at Sasquatch. And that's very important. But even though I don't personally consider either of these to be Sasquatch impressions, I am very glad that I casted them. By casting these footprints, you get to examine them up close, you can see more detail, you can really get to know the impression, you can feel the contours of the cast, you can search for hidden details such as dermal ridges. There is so much more information that you can gather by casting the animal's impression. So if you're watching this and you don't know how to cast footprints, I would highly recommend learning how to cast footprints so you can document this evidence for yourself. Learn from reading an article or learn from another Bigfooter in the area that can show you personally. Just learn how to collect this evidence properly so we can get more evidence to look at, more evidence on the table, and the more evidence we bring in, the more we get to learn about the behavior and the characteristics of these creatures. And the more evidence and the more sightings that come in, patterns start to emerge, and maybe we can catch up to one of these things and get some good footage. And this is also very important. Sharing my evidence, opening up the evidence for peer review. That is a very important step in the scientific process. Examine the evidence for yourself, run your own tests, form your own hypothesis, and then when you come to your conclusion, share your work with others so they can take a look at the evidence, test it for themselves, try and replicate it. And if over time we can find something that's replicatable in Sasquatch research, That's how we're going to really get to know these things. But anyway, I had an excellent time on both of these trips, and I had a really fun time looking into these footprints, reading up on other footprint accounts, and really reacquainting myself with a lot of the other evidence that's been collected. But we have more exciting stuff on the way. I plan on getting back out in the Wichita Mountains again this weekend, and hopefully we'll find something interesting. But really, with that said, I think that's gonna about wrap up this video. I hope you guys enjoyed it, and as always, thanks for watching. Keep squatching.